Anglo-Nepal War 1814 to 1816. Border tensions and ambition expansions led to the inevitable Anglo-Nepal War in 1814. Nepal was in difficulty due to shortage of war materials, as Nepalese had been fighting continuously for half a century, ever since the unification process began. Huge amounts of resources were spent on the First and Second Wars against the Tibetans, and now they had to fight the numerically superior and well-equipped British. The commanders of the Nepalese army were hard pushed to concentrate the troops in times because they remained overextended and scattered in many places between the Tista River in the east to the Aknanda of Gadwal in the west. Badakaji Amar Singh Thapa, Sardar Bhakti Thapa, and Captain Bir Balbhadra Kuwar were not in favor of war with the British at the time, but Prime Minister Bhimsen Thapa and his officer had calculated otherwise. Nepal had about 14,000 troops. They had some pieces of cannons and about 4,000 rifles to fight the British. The Nepal East India Company War was a painful ordeal for Nepal. About half of the Nepalese territory was lost in this war. But the battles also proved the fighting mettle of the Nepalese under severely adverse conditions. The British military strategy against Nepal was to launch multiple offensives to split reaction while primarily threatening Kathmandu directly. Their strategy was to capture the whole of Kuman and Gadwal, Bushir in what is now a part of India, Himachal Pradesh, and adjoining hill states. The British also wanted to free other areas from Gorkha control. For this, they would have to contain the Sikhs and Matharas through alliance. They would also need to pacify the Chinese. The British made a detailed plan for a huge offensive thrust against Nepal, which was designed to divide the Nepalese forces into fragments. Their armed force not only greatly outnumbered the Nepalese side but had far superior weapons. Major General Marley led the 1st Division to seize the pass at Makwanpur at a preliminary step to advance to Kathmandu. Major General John Sullivan Wood led the 2nd Division. Major General Rollo Gillespie had the 3rd Division under his command, and his aim was to advance to Dehradun, Saranpur, and then reach Srinagar. Colonel David Ortolani was given the 4th Division to advance through Bilaspur, Ramgarh, Orki, Subathu, Jaithak, and then link up with Gillespie's troops. Captain B latter was given approximately 2,400 troops to secure a frame base and provide flank protection to Major General Marley's troops for the eastern direction. Battle of Jidget, 1814. With the help of an ousted Palpali king, Major General Wood planned to march on Suraj, Jitgadi, and Nuakot with a view to bypass the Butwal defenses, flushing out minor opposition on the axis and assault Palpa from a less guarded flank. Nepalese Colonel Uzir Singh Thapa had deployed his 1,012 troops in many defensive positions, including Jitgadi, Nuakot Gadi, and Kategadi. The troops under Colonel Ujir were very disciplined, and he himself was a dedicated and able commander. He was famous for exploiting advantage in men, material, and natural resources, and well versed in mountain tactics. The British advance towards Jidget began on January 1815. While they were advancing this fortress, crossing the Tinau River, the Nepalese troops opened fire from the fortress. Another of the attacks columns was advancing the captured Tansen Bazar. Here too, Nepalese spoiling attacks forced the general to fall back to Gorakhpur. About 70 Nepalese lost their lives in Jitgadi, meanwhile more than 300 of the enemy pre-rise. Battle of Mokwanpur Gadi, 1814. Major General Marley was tasked to occupy Hetauda and capture the fortress of Harirapur and Mokwanpur before proceeding to Kathmandu. His frontage of advantage lay between Rapti River and Bagmati River. After additional reinforcement, he had 12,000 troops for his offensive against the Makwanpur and Hariharpur axes. A big attack base was established, but Major General Marley showed reluctance to take risks against the Nepalese. Some skirmishes has already started taking place. Similarly, Major General George Wood, sometimes known as the Tiger of British Indian Army, proved exceedingly cautious against the hard-charging Nepalese. Colonel Ranabhir Singh Thapa, brother of Bhim Singh Thapa, was to be the sector commander of Makwanpur Hariharpur axis. He was given a large fortress and about 4,000 troops with old rifles and a few pieces of cannons. But the British could not move forward from the border. Colonel Ranbir Singh Thapa had been trying to lure the enemies to his selected killing area, but Major General Wood would not venture forward from Baragadi, and he eventually fell back to Betia. Not special military action had taken place in Hariharpur Gadi forest in the first campaign. Major General Bennett Marley and Major General George Wood had not been able to advance for an offensive against Makwanpur and Hariharpur Gadi fortresses. Battle of Nalapani, 1814. Gillespie's army entered Dehradun well before the declaration of war. When Balbhadra Kumar, commander of the Nepalese army defenses there, heard of the approach of the British army and its size, he realized that it would be impossible to defend the city. He withdrew from Dehradun and moved his 600 men, mainly of Purano Gorkha battalion, including departments, to a hill northeast of the city where he took a position in the small fort of Nalapani, Khalanga. The first British attack on Nalapani took place on 31st October, the day before the official declaration of war. Gillespie's plan was to storm the fort from three sides. Under cover of fire, pioneers swarmed up the walls, only to be cut down by the fearsome blast of Balbhadra's cannon. Gillespie's men fell back. Bravely, but perhaps a bit foolishly, Gillespie moved forward to rally him men, but a Nepalese army marksman got him. Marley and Wood never really recovered from the shock of Gillespie's death, and even with very substantial reinforcement, they could not be brought to engage the Nepalese army in their respective areas of responsibility. Major Mobe, who was next in command at Nalapani after reinforcement, bombarded the fort and breached the wall. The British forces then tried to storm the bridge, but hesitated when they found their way blocked by sharpened bamboo sticks. The Nepalese army troops fired on the attackers and drove them off. The day ended with the British withdrawing. British casualties for the day mounted to over 500 men dead and wounded, and still Balbhadra held his position. Morvay then instructed his by now strongly reinforced gunners to fire into the fort, and he sent scouts out to discover the fort's water sources. The water supply was finally blocked, and the Nepalese were forced to evacuate the fort on 30th November, but Balbhadra and some 70 of his men were able to cut their way through and escape into the hills. This battle more than any other established the warrior reputation of Gorkhalis. Balbhadra and his 600 had held against the might of the British native troops for a month. Jane Phillips has been killed. Even with only 70 remaining survivors after his water source had been cut off, Balbhadra refused to surrender. Instead, charged out and successfully hacked their way through the siege. It set the tone for the rest of the campaign. To the day, the British made memorials still stand in Nalapani. One in the honor of Gillespie, but the other in the highest traditions of the British Army in honor of our brave adversary Balbhadra and his gallant men. Battle of Jaithak, 1814. Nalapani had cost both sides dearly, but in Nahan and Jaithak, further west, they were to suffer more. Kaji Amar Singh Thapa's son, Ranajor Singh Thapa, was in command there. Nahan had been left undefended, and Ranajor Singh set up his defences at Jaithak on a ridge overlooking Nahan. Major General Martindale, who had meanwhile assumed command of Gillespie's forces, took possession of Nahan on 25th December and immediately set about preparation for the attack on Ranajor Singh's positions. The result of first day's battle at Jaithak was almost a repetition of the first day at Nalapani for the British. They were the very troops they were the very troops who had fought at Nalapani. British grenadiers, not just the native sepoys. During the night of 25th December, Major Richards set out, first taking his troops on a wide 16-mile sweep around to the north to get into positions for the attack on Ranajor Singh's Ridge early the morning. Major Ludlow, who led the attack up the southern slope of the ridge, left camp in the early hours of the 26th. The combined force of British Grenadiers and Indian sepoys carried on onto a small ruined temple where they were to await the attack by Major Richard's party to the north. In the distance, a small, lightly defended Nepalese army stockade was seen, which the British grenadiers in Ludlow's force attacked to avenge the humiliation they were suffering. This was a questionable move as it means abandoning the original battle plan. Jaspal Thapa, who had concealed the major part of his force in a slight hollow behind that stockade, sent out flanking parties on both sides of the British troops. When the force of the British charge was broken on the stockade itself, these flankers caught the British in deadly crossfire. The Nepalese army soldiers pursued the British down the mountainside. The Indian boys who were waiting in the shined area to the rear were caught up in the rush of the retreat, which rapidly developed in a rout. Ludlow and his men, defeated and exhausted, arrived back in camp at the foot of the ridge before 1,000 hours that morning, before in fact the attack had even been scheduled to begin. Meanwhile, Major Richards and his men on northern approaches managed to secure a point on the top of the ridge and held it throughout most of the day. But they were pinned down by Nepalese army fire, and instead of reinforcing them, Martindale, fearing another Nalapani, ordered Richards and his men to retreat. This first day of battle and Jaithak cost the British over 300 men dead and wounded and cooled Martindale's ardor for battle. For over a month and a half, he refused to take any further initiative against the Nepalese army. Thus, by mid-February, of the four British commanders the Nepalese army had faced till that time, Gillespie was dead, Marley has deserted, Wood had harassed into inactivity, and Martindale was partially incapitalized by overcautionness. It set the scene of Ochterlony to soon show his mettle and change the course of the war. Trying Trying times for Nepalese troops 1814 to 1860. Our west, the Nepalese were hopelessly overextended. Kuman, a key link in Nepalese army communication with the far west, was defended by a small force numbering perhaps 750 men with an equal number of Kumani irregulars. Altogether, about 1,500 men to defend a whole province. In addition, Dhoti was to the east of Kauman had been partially stripped of troops. Bamsa, as governor of Kuman, had final responsibility for the defense of the province. The British force, numbering initially over 4,500 men, was easily able to outmaneuver the Nepalese army defenders and force them to abandon one post after another. Despite a significant victory over Captain Hersey's force, which had been sent on a flanking movement through eastern Koman, and the capture of the captain himself, the Nepalese army was unable to stem the tide of the British advance. Hostidal Shah arrived in Almora with a small body of reinforcement troops. A further reinforcement of four companies was sent from Kathmandu to aid the beleaguered defenses of Kauman, but the difficulties of communication through the hills prevented them from arriving in time to be of any help. Meanwhile, hesitating Sen, Colonel Nichols, Quartermaster General for the British troops in India, to take charge of the Almora campaign and assign 2,000 regular troops to his fort in addition to the very large number of irregulars already assigned to the area, all of the against fewer than 1,000 Nepalese army soldiers. Hostidal Saha and some 500 Nepalese army men had sent out from Almora to secure Almora's northern line of communications with Kathmandu. This party was intercepted. Hostidal Saha, the ableist Nepalese army commander in this sector, was killed in the first moment of the battle. The Nepalese army suffered terrible loss. When word of the disaster reached the defenders at Almora, they were stunned. The British closed in one Almora, and the Nepalese army was unable to prevent the British advance. Subsequently, the British managed to establish gun position within 70 yards of the gate of the fort at Almora, and the British artillery point blank range. Bum Shah surrendered Almora on 27th April of 1815. Soldier morale. The final Nepalese army success of this period was in a way the most devastating to the opposition's morale. On 17th February, word reached Martindale and Jaithak of the approach of a small party of 200 Nepalese army reinforcement moving from Malon to Jaithak. Lieutenant Young, with some 2,000 irregulars, was sent out to intercept them. Contact was made, and the Nepalese army was surrounded. The Nepalese realized that there was little hope of victory, so they discussed their next move and decided to shell themselves dearly rather than surrender. With kukuri in hand, they charged the irregulars. Even though they were outnumbered 10 to 1, the irregulars broke before them, their morals shattered. From that time on, the Nepalese army treated the irregulars with contempt, and whenever they encountered a force of irregulars, no matter how strong, they charged. Regardless of numbers, the irregulars were never once able to withstand the hillmen and their kukuris. By the same token, a strong sense of mutual admiration started to take hold between the British regulars and the Nepalese. Second Battle of Malon and Jaithak 1815. The Second Battle of Malon and Jaithak cut the Nepalese army lines of communications between central Nepal and the far west. It also sealed the fate of Kazi Amar Singh Thapa at Malon and Ranajor Singh Thapa at Jaithak. At Malon, now Major General Arthur Loni had moved with extreme care, summoning reinforcements and heavy guns from Delhi until his total attack force consisted of over 10,000 men well equipped with heavy cannon. Qazi Amar Singh Thapa's position in the Malan Hills depended on Bilaspur in the lowlands for his food supplies, and the nature of the hills forced him to spread his forces very thin in an attempt to defend every vantage point. Ochterlony cut off the supply of food from Bilaspur and then turned his attention to the intricate network of defensive posts that were designed to withstand and frontal assault. Although rear fortifications supported these posts, none could withstand a long cannonade by heavy guns because Otterlony had sufficient troops to attack and overwhelm several positions simultaneously. Then thinly spread Nepalese defenses could be dangerously divided. Otterlony chose his target, a point on the ridge, and the proceed to move slowly, consolidating each position that he took and allowing the pioneers time to build roads so that the heavy guns could be moved forward to support each attack. After a series of carefully planned and executed moves, he succeeded in establishing a position of the crest of Diothal, not even 1,000 yards from Kazi Amar Singh Thapa's main fort at Malon. The old warrior Bhakti Thapa valiantly led assault after assault on this position, but he died and the position did not fall. Immensely impressed by Bhakti's sustained courage against impossible odds, the British made the well appreciated and honorable gesture of returning his body with full military honors. The British superiority in number made it inevitable that they would be able to establish themselves and their heavy guns on vantage point within range of Ranajor Singh fortifications sooner or later. Both Kaji Amar Singh Thapa and Ranajor Singh Thapa were thus hemmed in and looking down the barrels of the British gun when Bamsaz later arrived, announcing the fall of Almora. Although the old commander was still reluctant to surrender, Kazi Amar Singh Thapa at least saw the hopelessness of the situation and, compelled by circumstances and British guns, surrendered with honor for both himself and Ranajor Singh. The Nepalese army positions in the far west were turned over the British on 15th of May 1815. Second campaign. Development of Nepalese troops and the British offensive. The outstretched Nepalese army was defeated on the western forts, that is, Gadawal and Kumon area. Oktorloni had finally outfoxed Badakaji Amar Singh Thapa. He was the only successful British commander in the Nepalese Company campaign. British India appointed him as the main operational commander in the second offensive on the Bharatpur, Makwanpur, Harirapur front. Colonel Kelly and Colonel O'Holora uh, followed the river Bagmati to reach Hariharpur Gadi. Nepalese local officials and heads of villagers were bribed for sensitive information about the defensive positions in the area of Hariharpur Gadi. The information seriously compromised the Nepalese defenses. Secret routes would have given the enemy advantage even if they were able to get only a baton through. But the British were able to advance with more than a brigade's strength. Colonel Kelly and Colonel Horola launched their attack from two different directions on 29 February. Many Nepalese lost their lives. Kaji Ranajor Thapa withdrew to Sindhuligadi to link up with Bada Kaji Amar Singh Thapa. The British troops did not approach Sindhuligadi. They fell back to Makwanpur by the end of March 1816 AD. 2 days later, the ratified treaty was handed over the British in Makwanpur. The British had given a 15-day ultimatum to Nepal to ratify a treaty on 28th November. But the point of the treaty was very difficult for Nepal to ratify quickly. The delay provided the excuse for the British to commence the second military campaign against Nepal. Colonel Bhaktawar Singh Thapa, another brother of Bhim Singh Thapa, had been appointed as sector commander for defensive battle for the area from Vijaypur to Sindhuligadi in the first campaign. In the second campaign, Badakaji Amar Singh Thapa was detailed as sector commander for Sindhuligadi and the eastern fort. Colonel Bhaktawar Singh Thapa was manning his headquarters at Makwanpur Gadi. Major General David Oktruloni was the overall commander against Nepal with a huge number of British troops to assault the fronts, including Upardang Gadi, Sinchang Gadi, Kandra, Kandrang Gadi, Makwanpur Gadi, and Hariharpur Gadi. The Nepalese troops eventually withdrew from Hariharpur Gadi after a big battle. The situation became very critical for Nepal, and the British could have reached Kathmandu if the signing of the treaty was delayed any further. Major General Devil Oktruloni settled down to receive the treaty signed by Nepal Darbar through Chandra Ser Upadhyay, Pandit Gajraj Mishra, and finally through Bhakta Barsingh Thapa. The war ended with the Treaty of Sugauli, and Nepal succeeded in remaining independent but lost about half of her territory. The river Mechi became the new eastern border and the Mahakali the western border of Nepal. The historic Harikobot Nepalese army pavilion in Eastways. Nepal-Tibet War. Tibet War was a good market for Nepalese traders since ancient time, and Nepal had always maintained a good relation with Tibet. King Anshuvarma gave his daughter Rikuti in marriage to King Tesrangcho Gampo. Many Nepalese merchants and officials also married Tibetan girl. For Nepal, the relationship was profitable. Tibet herself had no mint, and Nepalese silver coins were the currency of Tibet as well. First Nepal Tibet War 1788. The relations started turning sour after the Mullah rulers started to mint impure silver coin just before their downfall. The Tibetans demanded that the coin can be replaced by pure silver ones. When Prithvinarayan Saha took over, he found that it would be a great loss to him if he cons- consented to the Tibetan demands. The case remained unsolved due to his untimely demise. Queen Mother Rajendra Lakshmi, the regent of minor king Ranabhir Saha, inherited the coinage problem which reached the circumulating point in 1788. Another sore point in Nepal-Tibet relation was Nepal's decision to provide refuge to Samarpa Lama with his 14 Tibetan followers. He had failed from Tibet to Nepal on religious and political grounds. Yet another cause for conflicts was the slow quality salt being provided by Tibetans to Nepal. All salt came from Tibet in those days. Tibet ignored the Nepalese ultimatums and then prompted the preparation for war. Nepal was soon preparing to launch multi-directional attack. Kerung axis. Kazi Balbhadra Saha was the main commander of the offensive attack from Kerung axis. Kazi Kirtiman Singh Basnet, Sardar Amar Singh Thapa, and Bhotu Pandey were the uh, subordinate commanders under him. Approximately 6,000 troops and 3,200 porters were dispatched for this operation. Their main objective was to capture Dirgacha through Kerong. The march of the troops was delayed because Balbhadra Saha became seriously ill. They crossed Kerong on 20th July 1788 and captured Junga on the 3rd of August 1788. Bhutu Pandey was captured by the Tibetans. The Nepalese troops were reinforced with 2,000 more troops, and Bhutu Pandey was freed from the Tibetans on 14th October 1788. Kuti Axis first. Sri Krishna Saha was the commander and Kazi Ranajit Pandey, Sardar Parath Bhandari, Captain Harsha Panta, Captain Narasingh Basnet, and Captain Narayan Khatri were the subordinate commanders under him. About 5,800 soldiers and 3,000 porters were allotted for the offensive operation. Later on, Kazi Abhiman Singh Basnet and Ranjit Kumar also joined this offensive. The Dalai Lama was taken by surprise, and to protect his sovereignty, he initiated a parallel approach whereby he asked military help from Sovan Shahi, the king of Jumla in West Nepal. All requested him to launch guerrilla activities and revolt against the Nepalese army in and around Jumla. Sovan did revolt and Humla and capture some fortresses. The Dalai Lama also asked for military help from the Chinese emperor. Additionally, he himself and Panchen Lama of Dirganga wrote a secret letter to the East India Company seeking military assistance. The Tibetans also initiated propaganda about having constructed a new road through the Tigray Valley and establishing a post at the front. They also rumored that they had assembled an army of 1,25,000 men, but the Tibetans could not get significant assistance from Jumla, China, or the East India Company. Kuti Axis II. Kaji Damodar Pandey was leading his troop with subordinate commanders Bamshaha, Devdutta Thapa, and others. He was given about 4,000 troops, and his objective was to capture Dirgacha, the Kuti Axis. The battles. Nepalese troops, having crossed the Himalayas, captured Choyang and Kuti in June 1788 and Sikarjong on 3rd August 1788 in spite of many difficult logistic limitations. Later, Bahadur Shah was able to provide some reinforcements and improve some logistics arrangements. Still, that was not enough and progress was slow. When the Nepalese were about to capture Dirgacha, both Kuti and Kirong, the Tibetans started to make compromises with Nepalese commanders. Bahadur Shah started negotiations, ultimately arriving at a solution. Prisoners were handed back to the Tibetans. Tibet was ready to pay tributes to the tune of rupees 50,000 in silver coins per annum to Nepal, and a treaty was signed on 2nd June 1789 in Kerong. The treaty is called the Treaty of Kerong by historians. Rasuagadi and Timure was the frame basis in the Nepal-Tibet War. Shabru Besi and Rasuagadi were strategic points in this war. Likewise, Listi and Duguna villages were the main bases for offensive operation against Tibet. They were the forwardmost dumping places of the Nepalese army. Although Rasuagadi and Dugunagadi fortresses were not constructed at the time, the places themselves were important because of their military significance. Second Nepal Tibet China War 1792. The Tibetans had signed the Kerang Treaty because they had no other option then. The Dalai Lama had not been able to get timely help, so he was, for the moment, ready to pay the rupees 50,000 per year tribute to come out of his difficulties. The amount was paid that year, but not the next year. Nepal took it as an insult. Bahadur Shah started preparing for the next battle with Tibet. Kerong Axis. Kazi Avi Abhiman Singh Basnet was appointed the commander of Kerang Front, and Captain Kalu Pandey, Sardar Jaswanta Bhandari, and Sardar Ranajit Kunwar were his subordinate commanders. Their tasks were to capture Jungha initially and link up with Kazi Damodar Pandey to capture Dirgacha. Kuti Axis first. Kazi Damodar Pandey was the commander of the Axis. Kazi Devdutta Thapa, Captain Bom Saha, Kazi Jahar Singh Basnet, Sardar Pratiman Ranamagar, Taksari Narsingh Gurung were initially his subordinate commanders. Their task was to capture the Kuti area and join Kazi Aviman Singh Basnet to capture Dirgacha. Kharta Axis, Kazi Kritiman Singh Basnet was the overall commander, and Suba Puran Sahi, Suba Padma Singh Basnet, and Suba Madhur Sahi were his subordinate commanders. They were supposed to capture Karta initially and link up with the Mother Pandey in Kuti to capture Dirgacha. His troops were to advance Chainpur, now in Sangfa Sabha district. The battle. Rasuagadi and Timure were vital for reinforcement and logistic support. A fortress was there since the Malla period. Similarly, Listi and Duguna villages were the nearest point for logistic backup. Nepalese troops would later resist the Sino-Tibetan offensive from here as it was unsuccessful for defensive battles. All the commanders succeed in their missions in general. Dirgacha failed and the Lamas retreated. Nepalese commanders demanded 50 darni, 120 kg of gold and 100 rupees from the Tibetan authority in Dirgacha. The Lamas refused to pay, leading the Nepalese troops to pl- plunder Dirgacha. After the Nepalese troops returned to Nepal, the Dalai Lama and the Chinese Ambans forwarded a complaint to Chinese emperor about the Nepalese invasion, seeking military help from China. The Nepalese were rejoined, and at the conclusion of this successful offensive against Tibet, Bahadur Shah became even more popular in Nepal, and he was held as a worthy son of a worthy father. The honeymoon ended with news that a vast Chinese army had reached Lhasa to help Tibet against Nepal. On Earth March 1792, Nepal was finding that it was using up a lot of scarce national resources on military campaigns, the Unification Battles, the earlier Nepal Tibet War against the impending war against Sino Tibetan joint forces. Fukang and Elishthungthang Changchun was the main commander of the Sino-Tibetan joint forces. One report suggests that he was leading approximately 11,000 Chinese plus 3,000 Tibetan troops. They had 3,000 troops in reserve. By that time, Tibet had also prepared 10,000 local troops under Kolong Horkang, so the total strength of the enemy was approximately 17,000. Another report said that the invading joint forces, including irregulars, total 60,000 to 70,000. The Chinese troops were deployed along three different axes to launch their attack against Nepal. The first would advance through Kuti, Lhasa Kuti, Dugana, Listi, Jalbire, Chautara, Indravati River, Devpur, Naladam, and Kathmandu. The second would advance through Lhasa, Kerang, Rasuwa, Gadi, Bitravati, Nuakot, and Kathmandu. The third would take the route from Lhasa to the Khatra, Jainpur, Kathmandu. The third advance through Khatra consisted of a small group of about 3,000 soldiers, but they had trouble arranging logistic support from Tibet and knew that the local Kirans of Jainpur area would not support them, so they withdrew their troops prematurely. Consequently, the Chinese commander decided to launch his attacks from the two main axes. Uti axis under the command of Cheng Tse and Kerang axis. The Kerang axis was divided into two parts and headed by Fu Kang and the other by Kalong Horkan. For the Nepalese, the situation seemed like trying to plug a dam that had burst from a considerable height. Some Nepalese troops were already positioned in different fortresses of Tibet under Tularam Pandey, Satru Banjan Malla, Uddhav Khawas, etc. Damodar Pandey was appointed to overall command against the Chinese offensive. The joint enemy force attacked Nepal at a difficult time. Most of the Nepalese troops were engaged in the Western Unification campaign. On the troop of that, they were busy crushing revolts launched in Acham, Doti, and Jumla. Only a limited number of surplus soldiers were available to fight against the Chinese invaders. Nevertheless, Bitawarti Nuwakot was fixed as the last line of defense, and the major defensive battle would be fought from the position. Troops and commanders were called in from Kuman and Gadwal to fight against the Sino-Tibetan forces. Some troops were sent to take up defensive positions in Kirat and Morang area. The battle in Kuti and Khasa started with small confrontations. The Nepalese had good defensive positions in Duguna and Listi areas. The Chinese army entered the Kirung fort defended by Shatru Bhajan Malla, Subedar Talaram, and Udhan Khawas with a small number of troops. Tularam Pandey was shot dead at the gate of the exterior fortress and Shatrubhajan was badly wounded. The battle ensued for 5 days and all the fortresses of Kirung were lost to the Chinese. In the initial battle on the Kirung fort, about 400 Chinese soldiers and 200 Nepalese lost their lives. The Nepalese army retreated to Rasuagadi from the Kerang front for delaying action. The tactic was to hold the enemy's heavy thrust for a few hours and retreat. Sebru Besi was the next delaying position after Rasuagadi. Bhaskar Rana Magar and Subedar Akbal joined the Srinath battalion in Sebru Besi and they were also reinforced from Kathmandu. The Nepalese troops held its place for about 18 hours. Then they successfully broke contact and retreated to Ramche. By this time, hundreds from the both sides had lost their lives. A small battle took place in Ramche from where Kaji Damodar Pandey took over. The Nepalese again fell back to Gunche, but it was too narrow a place to come into contact with the enemies, forcing the Nepalese to retreat to Daibong for the major defensive offensive battle. It was a well chosen position. The Chinese had held the battle imitative of Tiramche. By the time the actual defensive battle was started, the Nepalese army had secured good defensive position in Dudathumka, Daibong, and Gerkhu areas and stretched the Chinese uncomfortably. A strong force was deployed in Bitravati. Trishuli Bazar was also occupied, and other Nuwakot villages were vacated to protect the civilians in the vital grounds of defensive battles. Meanwhile, elsewhere, Kazi Amar Singh Thapa gave up the year-long conquest at Longargadi in Goodwall and released his troops for the defense of the motherland. The soldiers had to cover a distance of more than 1,000 kilometers from the western outpost to reach Nuhakot. They made it in about a month by traveling some 30 kilometers per day. Some of them joined the Nuhakot defenses, while others remained as reserves in Kathmandu. By this time, the Nepalese troops had retreated about 85 kilometers from their initial defense position in Kerala. A linear defense was set up along the Betravati River. The Dude Thumka hill was a ground of tactical importance and a strong position was held by the Nepalese. Here, it would be difficult for Chinese to launch an uphill attack. One battalion plus Chinese troops did march to capture Dunse but could not do so. A big flood in the furious Bitravati on 20th August 1792 washed away many Chinese troops. The Bitravati bridge was destroyed by the Nepalese before it fell into enemy hands. The Chinese could only use the handling rope of the bridge to cross the river. The enemy troops marched to the capture the Gerkhu Ridge. This would have been a good frame base for them to launch downhill assaults on Nuwakot and Trishuli Bazar. Earlier successes had made them underestimate the Nepalese troops to the extent of launching a daylight uphill assault, but the Nepalese launched counterattack from many flanks. A large number of Nepalese troops attacked the enemy with only kukris from flank and rear positions. The attrition was overwhelming, forcing the enemy to take forcing forcing the enemy to take flight. The turning point of the battle and the war came here and led to the overextended Chinese dropping their insistence to negotiate only after Nuwakot fell. Phuket and wanted to negotiate in Nuwakot and was keen to preserve his troops. Nepal had been saved, but it had been a close call, and Nepal ended up paying tributes to the Chinese Emperor. The last battle was fought on 5th October 1792. The Treaty of Betravati was concluded and the war was over. Third Nepal Tibet War 1855 to 856. Nepal was enjoying a degree of political stability under Jangbahadur Rana, the founder of the hereditary Rana prime ministerial system, who contributed to develop his army. Jangbahadur was mentally prepared for the impending war against Tibet. The Treaty of Betravati was humiliating and painful for Nepal. Jangbahadur wanted to recover this loss of national prestige. After working to keep the British and the Chinese at bay, Jangabadar procured around 14,000 fresh soldiers, about 80 pieces of 12-pounders cannon, and 24 pieces of 6-pounders cannon. Many pieces of mountain mortars and Houzilers were arranged and they were in Nepal. About 12,000 fighting troops were detailed for internal security. The Eastern and Western commanding generals were told to prepare 5,000 more troops from each command sector. Many technicals were employed for manufacturing guns, ammunition, cannons, and warlike materials. Winter clothing like bakku and docha were made for all fighting troops. This was the biggest war preparation after Anglo-Nepal War. Many defense posts were created and Nepalese army personnel were deployed in the major axes including Dankuta and Jumla. Nepal sent a letter to the Tibetan Authority demanding that Talangkot and the areas of Kuti and Kerang be given back to Nepal. The losses suffered by Nepalese traders in Tibet had to be refunded to the tune of rupees 10 crore, 10 crore in silver coins to Nepal. Tibet refused. Jangabador declared war in March 1855. The Kerang Axis was commanded by General Bom Bahadur Kumar. Approximately 25,728 troops were in the Axis. The Kuti Axis sector commander was General Dir Samser was about 4,678 troops. Humla and Mustang was commanded by General Krishna Das Kumar and 2,500 troops were deployed there. And Okhalchung Gola Axis was commanded by Colonel Prithvi Dos Kumar with a force of 2,000. Sathya Kazi was the main enemy commander with about 50,000 troops. There were 800 troops detailed on the Dirgacha front and 40,000 troops were concentrated in the Tingri area. The Nepalese troops captured Kerong without any confrontation, but the Tibetans were ready to launch a counterattack in their chosen grounds with a massive force. Knowing the Tibetan intentions, Jangabadar sent reinforcement, a huge force and cannon under the command of General Jagat Samser Kumar and Colonel Vaktajang Kumar. Both Bahadur marched up to uh, Kukurghat with ease. Battles continue in the Janga area for 10 days and many Tibetans died. Finally, the Tibetans surrendered. In Guntagadi, a formidable fortress on the top of the almost vertical mountain, the Tibetans remained strong with about 6,500 troops. When the Nepalese troops reached close to the fortress, the Tibetans started clearing. The climate was very cold and windy. There was also a heavy snowfall. Many Nepalese soldiers died. This led to the preparation of another attack from two different directions, which finally proved to be successful. Many Tibetans died. About 600 were captured and prisoners of war. Another battle took place at Jungagadi, a very strong rocky mountain fortress capable of housing 10,000 troops. About 6,000 Tibetans were there to defend it. Although the climate was unfavorable for the Nepalese, they tried several times to capture the fortress. There were 1,100 prisoners of war captured. The battle cost the lives of 1,721 Tibetans and 372 Nepalese. Meanwhile, General Dhir Shamsher was leading the troops in Kurti. He had a battle in Shushan in April 1855. Kuti had been captured, and before crossing the Tibetan border, he built a fortress in Duguna village near Listi village, which also served as a forward logistic base. To have to have a treaty rather than a continue fighting. A diplomatic mission facilitated by the Chinese arrived in Kathmandu on 13th August 1855 for discussion about could not reach a solution. At that time, Nepalese troops were still in Tibet. The next meeting took place in Shigarjang, Tibet, where Nepalese demanded 90,000 rupees as war compensation. The Tibetans refused to pay but wanted the withdrawal of Nepalese troops. They were secretly organizing a huge force. Eventually, the Tibetans launched a big counterattack with 15,000 troops on the Nepalese position of Kuti on 1st November 1855. It was a surprise attack and Nepal troops fell back to Gunagadi and Listi. The Tibetans also launched a big counterattack in Junga, but Prithviman Warana held his position. Jangabadur got the message in Kathmandu and he sent reinforcement to both Junga and Kurti. General Dhir Samsir again launched multi-directional attacks against the Tibetan army in Kurti. The Nepalese eventually won the battles in both the places. To stop the Nepalese offensive, the Tibetans agreed to a treaty again. Asona Gumba was a strong fortress in the area where 8,000 Tibetan troops were holding up with cannons. Dhir Samsir launched a surprise attack, but many lives were lost both sides. Nepal eventually won. The Tibetan term arrived in Kathmandu in January 1856, and after a month, the Treaty of Thapathali was signed between Prime Minister Jang Bahadur Rana and Kolen Chatra of Tibet. This treaty was more favorable for Nepal than the Treaty of Bitrawati. Victory Parade, London, and 8th June 1946. Foreign encounters. Indians Mutiny 1857. The Indians had started their independence struggle against the British Empire in the 1800, in 1800s. The struggle spread to the Indian native armed force serving the British. The mutiny began from the Meerut cantonment. The British Empire requested Nepal for help. The Shield Prime Minister and Commander-in-Chief Jangabadur Rana himself took part in the suppression of the mutiny with Kol Pahal Man Singh Basnet and Kol Bhairav Narsingh Rana along with some 17,000 Nepalese troops. About 5,000 mutineers were killed and some 500 captured in Gorakhpur, Jaunpur, Lucknow, Pripyat, Sefjang, Singanj, Baliwa, and Jalanpur. By the Nepalese expedition, the relation between the British and the Nepalese naturally further improved. On 18th November 1860, an agreement between the two governments were signed. The 10 areas lying between Mahakali River and Rapti River, which was lost by Nepal in the 1816 Sugoli Treaty, was returned by the grateful British. the First World War 1914 to 1918. The Nepalese army participated in World War I with the 1st Rifle, Kali Box, Samser Dal, Jabbar Jung, Pasupati Prasad, Bhairav Nath, 2nd Rifle, Bhairang and Srinath battalions. The total number of any troops deployed to India at the time was 14,000. Troops were armed with the Martin Henry and Enfield rifle. General Babar Samser, General Tej Samser, and General Padam Samser were the main commanders. The discipline, professionalism, and adaptability of the Nepalese soldiers was again well respected in the First World War. Additionally, Nepal also sent almost 200,000 troops, the cream of its manhood, and proportionality a higher percentage of military-aged men than most countries to fight as part of the British Indian Army itself. The generous assistance was later extended with even more troops in Second World War. Wa- Waji- Waziristan War 1917. Waziristan in the NW frontier of British India had revolted against British rule. Their Pathan warriors called Masuds were outstanding fighters and they had board to fight the British, who were at this moment deeply involved in the First World War. The British requested the Nepalese army to help neutralize the movement. The Mahindra Dal Battalion and 1st Rifle Battalion were involved in the suppression of the movement from March 1917. This was a joint military operation. Nepal's 1st Rifle was British 43rd Brigades and the Mahindra Dal Battalion was 45th BTE. The Nepalese army had to accept many casualties. Nepalese army units, British Gurkha regiments, and British regulars had fought soldiers to shoulder. Many Annie soldiers were decorated with British medals. Afghan War 1919. After the end of the First World War, British India decided to go to war in Afghanistan. Nepal was, as usual, requested to provide military assistance to the British. Revi- revi- Revitalized tactical training for the Nepalese army started in May 1919. Nepalese troops commanded by Jan Bahadur Samser reached India and the British army received them with a 13-gun salute. The troops were concentrated in Ottawa. Later the group was deployed in Nausira and the second group in Marken. Meanwhile, the Amir of Afghanistan had sought Russian assistance, but Russia, being engaged in its own internal problems, was unable to help, and Afghanistan was bounded to accept a peace treaty. Nepalese troops were stationed there for 3 months.